Hello and welcome to Reframed, Disability Aesthetics and Institutional Change, an event in partnership between the British Council and Disability Arts Online. I'm Aidan Moesby, a middle-aged white man with a Northern English accent, white hair and glasses. I'm a disabled neurodivergent curator, artist and cultural access and inclusion consultant. I work mainly around the themes of climate change and well-being. And now I hand you over to Nora from the British Council.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this discussion on disability, aesthetics and institutional change in the visual arts. I believe we've been we are representation from over 50 countries today, which is fantastic. My name is Nora Campbell and I'm the Head of Arts for British Council in Scotland, which might be given away by my accent. I'm a white woman with grey hair, which is short, and I'm wearing glasses, a navy top and a grey scarf. The intersection of arts and disabilities has long been a site of both challenge and opportunity across the arts, and this is a pivotal moment for the reflection for the visual arts sector in particular. This year at the Venice Biennale, the first pavilion entirely dedicated to the UK's disability arts movement has been opened by Shape Arts, while the finished pavilion also featured work of a disabled artist, and there'll be links appearing in the chat for you to look at. We are delighted to have with us representatives from both pavilions to explore key questions today, such as what are the key challenges and opportunities at this moment? What does best practice look like? And what are the key initiatives taking place? As the British Council, we aim to find new ways of connecting with and understanding each other through the arts. And I would like to thank Disability Arts Online as our partner on this webinar. We've been working with them for a number of years to raise awareness of the work of disabled artists and disabled-led organisations. And a link will appear in the chat if you'd like to find out a bit more. We believe the connections we build through the arts and culture transform lives and create positive change. So I'd like to look forward to hearing from our panellists on their experiences of creating change in the visual arts. I shall now pass back to our curator, Aidan Moesby, to introduce the first panel. Aidan, over to you.
Thanks, Nora. Once again, welcome to Reframed, Disability Aesthetics and Institutional Change in the Visual Arts. I'm incredibly pleased to have been able to curate this event with Disability Arts Online and the British Council for a lively mixture of presentation, conversation, and questions from the audience. Today is an introduction to some of the issues and considerations when thinking about how to increase the inclusion and representation of disabled artists within our institutions and beyond. We have two panels today with four amazing panelists. Each of the panelists has a different perspective and expertise and will respond to the overall theme and a provocation or question they've been given as a starting point for their contribution. The first panel is exploring institutional change, and the second is from the perspective of disabled artists and curators as we unpick the disability aesthetic. In a general sense, the disability aesthetic is artworks made within the context of the disabled lived experience or includes elements and materials from that experience within its form, production, or materiality. So to get the panels underway, I now hand over to Tony Heaton, who's chairing the first panel on institutional change. Tony, thanks.
Hi, Aidan. Thank you. Hi, Nora. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation. My name's Tony Heaton. I'm a sculptor. I'm the chair of Shape Arts, and I also was the chief executive of Shape for over 10 years. And as Nora said, Shape is curating the DAM in Venice, the disability arts movement, alongside the Biennale up until November. So I want to say hello, but also to say hello to my four distinguished guests on my panel, and I'm going to introduce them. I'm hoping they're going to pop onto this screen soon, but I can name. Maybe I should name check them. Oh, they're popping up now, which is great. Hi, Eleanor. Sean's here. Kate's here. That's great. Who's missing?
Yvonne.
Yvonne. Come on, Yvonne, say hello to us. Pop up on our screen. Have we lost Yvonne?
She's appearing there. I think if you just start with the introduction.
I'll crack on and I'll introduce her. So first up, I've got Eleanor Morgan, and Eleanor's from Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art, MIMA, and Eleanor's a curator and a writer based in the Tees Valley, who is committed to advocating for artists and building a more equitable art centre. Next up, I've got Kate Bremer from Berlinclusion. Kate's disabled British Australian curator, arts educator, and mum, based in Berlin. Next up is Sean Lee. Sean's an artist, curator, and director of programming at Tangled Art and Disability. And Yvonne Bollimore, whose interdisciplinary practice facilitates situations for collective learning, exchange, and experiences with particular attention to feminist and ecological practice. Hi everyone. It's good to see you. Now, we've got 5 minutes each to talk about how we make institutional change. And we're on a tight time scale, as Aidan said. So I'm going to be a ruthless timekeeper and keep you all to 5 minutes each. And I'm going to bang a really big gong if you exceed 5 minutes, okay? So you've had fair warning. And to make life easier for you, I'm going to go first. And if I exceed 5 minutes, you can unanimously and unilaterally gong me. Okay, so, and I can get it out of the way then. So that's precisely what I'm going to do. So I'm going to kick off right now with my, whatever we call it. What do we call it? My provocation, I guess, on how you make institutional change. So an institution is a humanely devised structure of rules and norms that shape and constrain social behavior. All definitions of institutions generally entail that there is a level of persistence and continuity. There are laws, rules, social conventions, and norms. They're all examples of institutions. So how do I know this? Well, that's what Wikipedia tells me. So to effect change, we need to challenge this definition because almost all humanely devised structures are usually created to meet the needs of non-disabled people because they're created by non-disabled people. And by this fact, they exclude many disabled people. And I use the term disabled people as defined by the social model of disability. Now, the arts like to think it's liberal, but in many instances, it's deeply conservative and middle class. It's largely white and largely non-disabled. Consequently, its thinking and social conventions are framed within these parameters. And to fit in, many of us who choose to work in the arts have got to attempt to conform to this. But to try to effect change, we misfits have to be somewhat subversive in challenging the institutional conventions that discriminate against us and disable us. And if we do it overtly, we are usually branded as troublemakers and subtly excluded. But trying to effect change as the only voice in an institution of others who don't want to change often becomes a long war of attrition. And hence the importance of our historic fight for rights that eventually became the DDA, the Disability Discrimination Act of 1995. It's since been watered down and subsumed into the Equality Act 2010. But this fight for rights changed the law here in the UK to make it illegal for the first time in our history to have people who discriminated against brought to law. And of course, this fight for rights is the background story for the exhibition that's now in Venice, curated by Shape. So making institutional change, well, it means having disabled people at the decision-making table, having disabled people involved, because mostly it's all about power and rank. But of course, that means that somebody around that table needs to make room. And of course, nobody wants to. Making institutional change means challenging yourself and testing your privilege. Many people are quite happy as they are. They don't want to change. They don't want to challenge themselves. They don't want to change their ableist attitudes. And finally, making institutional change means viewing disability as a socially constructed set of barriers that can be changed. Because disabled people can't change. It's not down to us. It's down to you guys. So, okay, that's me. Over. Onwards. Phew, I didn't hear any gongs or bangs or anybody complaining. So I must have got in under the wire within my 5 minutes. So, Eleanor, it's up to you next to accept my challenge of a 5-minute presentation. So if you're there and you're ready, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Tony. I mean, I have to say this is the biggest topic in the smallest amount of time, but I'll do my So hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Eleanor and I'm MIMA's artistic director. And MIMA is a museum and gallery based in Middlesbrough, and we're part of Teesside University. I'm a white woman in my late 30s with messy bobbed curly hair, and I'm wearing glasses and a checked collarless shirt. And I'm sitting with lots of books behind me to make me look very learned. So let's just start by reminding ourselves that 24% of the British population are disabled. Disabled people are a core part of our society. We are gallery, museum, publics. We are constituents to those institutions. We are the workforce and we are artists. At MIMA, we've worked to develop an organisation that foregrounds access with and for constituents and visitors, that builds a more diverse workforce over a long period of time, and that supports disabled and neurodivergent artists and curators. This is an iterative process. It's a constant state of becoming. It's not something that you can finish and complete. It doesn't work on the checklist where you get to tick it off. MIMA is many things, and therefore we have many responsibilities. We're a learning and teaching environment, a centre for research, a site for production and presentation of art, and a collecting museum. And I just want to remind us that museums and galleries are an essential part of society. We are memory institutions. We're the sites where ideas are developed and stored for the future. So if disabled artists and curators' perspectives are not foregrounded in these spaces, our society suffers now and in the future. The stories that we tell and learn from are diminished. So part of my question was, why is it important to work with disabled artists? And I guess I just want to flip that by asking, what would we be missing by not foregrounding disabled curators and artists' ideas in this space? Right, where am I in my next bit? Okay, so I've chopped all of this around. Relationships drive our work, and I think it's ideas and relationships that drive change, actually. I also think it's important to remember that every person and every relationship is different. And having said this, we know that disabled and neurodivergent people face multiple barriers, and we need a caring and approach to supporting the development of disabled practitioners. Often disabled and neurodivergent people have not had the same access to education, support structures, and professional opportunities as their non-disabled peers. A large proportion of creative people are disabled and neurodivergent, and our creative courses in universities are populated by disabled and neurodivergent practitioners. But by the time we get to large-scale institutional shows, only a small number of those are by disabled artists. So I just want to share a couple of examples of recent projects that we've been involved with, and this is a very much part of a community of practice that MIMA joins. So we're a founding member with Dash and others of the Future Curators programme. And this is a long-term programme designed to support the conceptual and professional development of deaf, neurodivergent and disabled curators. And this is about making long-term sector change. This is not a quick process. Through the first phase of this, we worked with Aidan, who you just met earlier, as an associate through 2019 and 20, through a paid position to work with us. And since then, we've maintained a connection and support for Aidan's curatorial practice. And we've worked with him across the past 3 years to develop the next main exhibition at MIMA, which includes 15 artists and 3 new commissions. And this benefits the organisation. This has brought many new voices and perspectives into our programme and practices. It's brought richness to the how and the what of the organisation. In, more informal, sustained relationships with artists, we've worked closely and had the honour of commissioning and exhibiting disabled artists in our region, including photographer Kev Howard, who we commissioned and then acquired for the collection, and Lizette Orton, who's an amazing writer and performance artist who we've worked with for many years, and she is now one of 5 selected Tees Valley Artists of the Year who've been awarded a salary for a year and a development programme. So these are individual relationships that are affecting change through ripples of action and activity. I was asked to think about some of the changes we've had to make as an organisation, and I've said that, this is a process of becoming, it's an iterative process. But I think there are 3 things that are really key to our approach and our work at MIMA. The first is a flexible approach to time. You have to make a plan and then build in flex and contingency because people's lives are complicated. Disabled people's lives are especially complicated by the barriers in society. We aim to create open and honest spaces because it's a tough time in the sector and in people's lives. And we know that we all need to be honest about what we can do and how we can do it. And what comes with that is also a question of what we can't do or what we would like to do and could do in the future. And the third thing is a reflective learning approach. No one knows everything, and we can all learn through every project and every relationship. So I'll close there, hopefully in time. Thank you, Tony.
Oh, thanks very much, Eleanor. I forgot to bang the gong. I forgot to look at the clock. So you sounded like you were very concise and nailed it within 5 minutes. So thank you very much for that. And thanks for some really thoughtful comments that I'm sure will draw into the conversation as we develop things. Kate, I've got you coming up next. Hi again. I want to, I just want to plug something because Kate and I worked together years and years ago, went over to Berlin, and I found this, which is great. So it's a great publication. And
thanks, Tony.
that's great.
Maybe you can put it in the chat later so everyone else can have access to it.
I'll do my best to do that. I'm not very good at multitasking, so either you or me, or we can ask them to circulate it later.
Sure.
Fire away with your 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Tony, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak with such an amazingly vast international audience. It's such a privilege. I'm Kate Bremer. I'm an Australian-British crypt curator based in Berlin for the last 11 years. And I'm going to be talking about my independent curatorial practice and experience working as a consultant, an access consultant with German museums and arts organizations. And I guess what the differences are primarily between a German context and a British context, which I'm sure a lot of you are a bit more familiar with. I was asked to respond to the questions, what is the experience of disability in the visual arts in Germany, and also about Germany's resistance to change. And I thought that was a really provocative question, and I'm glad it was asked because I ask myself that question all the time and have done ever since I moved here. And I have a couple of things to say. So I think first I'll maybe just sort of explain a little bit about what it's like working here in Germany, or at least what my experience has been like. I would say that the experience of disability in the visual arts in Germany is a largely fragmented one. We have an art sector here that has a very complex, complicated arts funding system that is very difficult to understand, especially as a foreigner coming into the country. Even when you're in it, it's an extremely bureaucratic system. change is very slow moving, and it's difficult to find the information that you need. Access is not a given. Access is something that's still really growing here in terms of a basic consensus and understanding around what is needed for artists with disabilities to thrive. And that's something that applies to all disciplines, not just the visual arts, but across all disciplines here. Sustainability is a really large issue here in Germany for disability arts. And again, very generally, and that's largely because there is simply not enough funding. There is not enough funding across the board for disabled artists as individuals. There is not enough funding for arts institutions to be able to implement different access provision or make long-lasting changes to their buildings, to their programs, all kinds of things. What funding there is often project-based and short-term and never long-term. And added to that, and this is something that feeds into the next major issue that I see, is a fundamental lack of disability leadership in Germany. And by that, I mean there is a distinct lack of disability-led institutions, so arts institutions that are led by disabled people. And I mean both grassroots initiatives as well as established arts institutions. And there is a fundamental lack of disabled arts leaders in the field as well. So curators, directors, all different kinds of people who are in powerful or decision-making positions. And I don't know if I would call it a resistance to change. I would say that there is actually a very large desire within institutions in Germany, and also definitely within disability arts communities, for change, and is being demanded for, bottom up. And we have seen changes in leadership across the board in many different arts institutions across Germany, where change is coming and things are slowly changing. More directors of arts institutions are much more aware than they used to be about disability issues. There is policy change at a governmental level. There are changes in terms of our arts funding structures. So a lot more people with disabilities are being put onto arts funding juries. There are specific funds now, finally, specifically for disabled artists and arts workers. And that's definitely true for the Berliner state level, where the Berlin Senate Department for Culture and Social Cohesion, that's the name of the department, have created a fund in particular called Impact Funds, or Impact Fund, that specifically targets marginalized artists, not just with disabilities, but all kinds of marginalized artists. Funds like the Project Fund for Urban Practice, because of course Berlin has an extremely vibrant urban art scene. So there are attempts to try and make funding pots more accessible more broadly as well. Federally, we have at the Kulturstiftung des Bundes, so the Federal Arts Foundation for Germany, have a program for inclusive arts launched a couple of years ago that has a mentoring program for disabled artists and arts workers that's just in its infancy, and a broader theatre cooperations funded stream as well. It's all very basic. It's at the beginnings. So there is quite a big gap between the conversations and the kinds of conversations that are happening in the UK or in Australia or Canada, for example, or the US, and the kinds of conversations that are happening here. Some of the ways in which I deal with this as a practitioner is twofold. Firstly, through my small collective organization, Berlinclusion. We're a network. We work in partnership with other disabled arts practitioners. We're a mixed group of disabled and non-disabled people. We create art projects that are disability-led, and we try to lead by example. We try to embed access into everything that we do and try and steer the conversation away from aesthetics versus access, which has long dominated the German art scene here, towards a conversation that is much more about marrying access with aesthetics and how access can actually be a catalyst for aesthetics. We launched a residency program a couple of years ago for artists with and without disabilities, the first of its kind in Germany. Unfortunately, it hasn't been sustained due to a lack of appropriate funding for this. But through other projects that we tie into, we're trying to kind of keep that conversation going. Other projects such as an independent curatorial project I worked on a couple of years ago with the Gay Museum here in Berlin called Queering the Crip, Cripping the Queer, partners with other marginalized communities in the city and really seek to draw attention to intersectionality and try and sort of forge solidarity, pool resources, but also celebrate difference in a different way, I guess you could say. And again, kind of trying to make the case for, you know, that question that Eleanor mentioned before, you know, if institutions are the containers of memory, who are making those memories? How is art history being framed? And how can it be revisited and retold from crip or queer perspectives or perspectives of people of color and so on? So I think my 5 minutes is up. That was really short and really brief. I also didn't hear the gong, but I think I'm done.
I was getting nervous, Kate, but you know, I was kind of preparing the gong. But no, I think that was cool. And there's a couple of things popped up in the chat you need to look at. A couple of people agreeing wholeheartedly with you, but also Paul Dark, who said, "Can you give Kate my email because he's going over to Berlin soon." So check him out in there, and I'm going to move on. Thank you very much, Kate. Really appreciated it. Lots for us to think about there. Lots of questions, and I'm going to come to Sean. Hi, Sean Lee. How you doing?
Hi, Tony. Good. I'm so thrilled to be here today.
Oh, that's fantastic. And you're coming all the way from Canada, which is fantastic as well. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say for us. Again, I'm just going to remind you, quick 5 minutes, Sean, it flies past. So check
Oh,
it out.
God.
Check it out. All right. Over and out. Take go for it.
Great. Thank you. Hi, everyone. So thrilled to be here. I'm Sean. I will start just by saying I'm somebody who's male presenting. I use he and they pronouns. I'm East Asian Chinese with relatively light skin. I'm also someone who's visibly disabled, so my back curves, my shoulders are uneven. And if we were meeting in person, you'd probably notice how short of stature I am. I am coming to folks from so-called Canada. I'm based in Toronto, also known as Tech Toronto. It's the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And I start with this because my provocation doesn't just include questions of the development of disability arts practices and accessibility, but also brings in the context, the very necessary context of Canada's colonial history. And so as we think about these things, I want to give a bit of context. In 2008, there was a nationwide Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was created in order to document the history and lasting impacts of Canadian colonial systems, Indian residential school systems on Indigenous peoples and their families. And so the work that's culminated from this was a very comprehensive report in 2015, which included a number of calls to actions. I bring this up because in parallel, there are lots of different calls to actions for accessibility as well, particularly thinking through the Accessible Canada Act. In a more local context, I come with the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And so often these different kinds of actions, these different acts, call on us to create different kinds of change in our systems without acknowledging what kind of change we're being brought into. And so I bring up this a word that I have learned from another Crip Indigenous artist, Elwood Jimmy, from Thunderchild First Nation. And Elwood talks about this idea of extensibility as opposed to accessibility. And what Elwood says is that the word accessibility has come to be associated with different forms of accommodations, often related to mobility and language. But we very seldom question what this accessibility gives us access to. These associations can become very restrictive because they're privileging this modern colonial way of being that ultimately elevates individuality. And so what Elwood, I think, is talking about is that engagements and conversations about accessibility and disabilities mirror many of the problems we find when organizations attempt to include indigenous and other racialized bodies into modern colonial spaces. And what Elwood really is saying is that efforts to decolonize and indigenize without tackling um, the ontological issues, the ways of being, really end up creating moments where we are ultimately just trying to slide people into normative colonial spaces. And that unless we're prepared to be differently, rather than just do or know things differently, then colonial habits of being ultimately remain unchallenged. I think ultimately what's happening is that Indigenous and disability communities have had um, uh, have have experienced relationships with time and temporality that ultimately have been weaponized and instrumentalized against us. And so when we bring in a disability justice approach to understanding accessibility, when we bring in a disability justice approach to indigenization, we're really beginning to tackle the systemic ways that these have manifested rather than just trying to slide people normatively into the structures that already exist. I think about the definition of ableism given to us by Talila T.L. Lewis in the States, in which ableism isn't just an experience, but rather it's a systemic issue in which people's bodies and minds, body minds, are just valued based on these socially constructed ideas of normality and intelligence and productivity. And so these constructed ideas become very deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, in colonial logics, in misogyny, in capitalism. And so these forms of systemic oppression lead to people in society determining who's valuable, who's worthy, essentially based on a person's ability to create, to excel, and to behave. And we all know that disabled folks, our bodies, our minds are too wild to fit into these kind of constructed places, as Tony's mentioned. And so I think we really need to change not just this idea of bringing people and the change will happen, but we need to create the space, we need to create the context in order for this to happen. I think back to a time at Tangled where I work. Tangled is a disability art gallery. We're dedicated to exhibiting mad, deaf, disabled artists, to enhancing accessible curatorial practices. I bring up an exhibition in 2020 where Carmen Papalia, working with a number of racialized indigenous artists, we wanted to create an exhibition that reclaimed the museum on the terms of the disabled body mind. And so often what these artists brought up was that museums and institutions are really interested from the diversity, equity, inclusion lens of bringing artists in. But as soon as it pushes against institutional ways of working, as soon as something might be late or something might not arrive the way it was described, that change, that openness, that desire for disability is suddenly cut off. And so in the exhibition, Undeliverable, what we ultimately said was, what happens if our institutional structures center mutual accountability? And we managed at Tangled to start including in our contracts, in our very colonial kind of these colonial documents. We've always wanted to show our ethos. How can we have care? How can we have, places for that honor crypt time and crypt ways of working? And so we've begun including what we call a care clause into all of our contracts. A care clause essentially stating that everything that's been written in this contract, in the quote unquote deliverables, should never supersede the health and well-being of an artist or the people that are working with us. And so I think ultimately, we were taking on this this logic of creating a space to honor crypt time. And I think it's ultimately part of disability curation, centering the work of access within a curatorial and aesthetic practice alongside exhibition design. Can create access that's not just based on socio economic ways, but actually socio emotional ways, defining that as like how access relates to trust and relationships of care and respect. And so ultimately we want to bring in extensibility, as Elwood has said, not just access.
You're guilt
But yes,
tripping me here.
I will pass it back to you, Tony, because I'm
you're guilt
hitting
tripping
my
me.
time.
Talking about crypt time, and I'm thinking I've got to move on, Sean. And then he comes into crypt time, and I'm going, oh no, I can't
It's the
interrupt.
conflicting access that always happens. But I'll pass it back to you, Tony. Thank you.
Sean, that was brilliant. Lots of really interesting stuff for us to think about, and lots of stuff in the chat. So don't forget to check the chat out. Lots of big positives coming at you there, Sean. Thank you, Yvonne. Oh,
thank you.
Doing?
Yes, nice to see you. Super nice to be here. So hi, I'm Yvonne Billymore. I use the pronouns she and they. I have short brown hair and fair skin, and I'm wearing chunky round glasses today. Behind me is a kind of white wall, but also various boards, a wooden board and a tatami mat, and might see an occasional dog tail. I am also a new dog mum, so I might have to jump off a screen at some points if she's chewing something. But yes, I am a curator, and I am the artistic director of an organisation called the BioArt Society, which is based in Finland. I'm here in Helsinki taking this call. I also was the co-curator of the Pavilion of Finland's exhibition at the Venice Biennale this year, which I co-curated with Jussi Koitila, and it featured the artists of Pia Lindman, Jenny Julia Wallenheimo-Heimonen, who is here in the session with us and will be speaking later, also Veda Somya, and the architectural designer Kaisa Soot. So yes, I'm super grateful to be invited to be here with you all today and to listen and to learn from you all. I am no expert, I think, on these matters. I, for many years or always, have had threaded into my practice these questions and doings of equity, access and justice across the spectrum. But it's maybe only in the last few years that I've been working with and turning my attention towards disability justice, art, activism and approaches. And of course, understanding these as struggles that are interconnected with various systems of oppression marked by colonialism and capitalism and the patriarchy, as Sean very articulately describes there. So yes, I started kind of turning my attention to access and accessibility framed by disability justice through Frame Contemporary Art Finland's Rehearsing Hospitalities programme, where I was the associate curator, again working with Jussi Koitila, where we were using the concept of hospitality to really think about these wider relations with power and agency, and what those different power relations were. And so very much exploring how to do hospitality otherwise, and also use public programs as a way to generate institutional change. So not just treating things thematic, but actually changing the inner structures and the daily practices. And it was a 5-year public program. In the first year, we started working with the hospitality towards different or diverse knowledges and ways of knowing. Then in the second year, we picked up these questions of access, and then carrying still with access these questions around epistemologies. As we went into the third year, we started to work with questions of care and security and safety. And then in the latter year, the final years, around sort of redistribution. But these were, it was always really important that we stayed with these questions while we turned in new directions and picked up new questions. So I think generally I'm really interested in this approach where you stay with a subject rather than kind of tokenizing it or making it thematic, but rather build it up and complicate it as you turn in these different directions. And this was really the groundwork for the Venice project, which is titled The Pleasures We Choose, where we consider generally these different embodied responses to the world that challenge normative expectations and assumptions about bodies and labour, value, usefulness, productivity, time, ability, etc., and instead assert that all bodies should be afforded the right and are deserving to choose pleasure. And so I think this is many of the artists that we worked with, in fact, all of the artists, Vida, Pia, and Yanni-Yulia, are artists that we started developing relationships with in the Rehearsing Hospitalities program. And then we were sort of changing this to a very different setting in a national pavilion. And again, thinking about how we can work in those kind of contexts otherwise. Challenging some of the normative expectations and around like how you move through a space, how much time you're supposed to spend in this space in a particularly rushed, and I call it a sort of exhibition bagging experience. So yes, we were really thinking about how you slow down and how you can afford these artworks and the bodies who have created them the attention that they deserve as well. And so I think there was also, like in my prompt, a little question about access and aesthetics and how this sits amongst this. And I very much agree with what Kate mentioned earlier, that we need to work on disrupting this false binary of access and aesthetics and instead find ways to marry them. I think access for me is also primarily a doing, but it's that's my role as a curator, and it's working with artists such as Yanni-Yulia, who I mentioned is going to be speaking in the next panel. Really shows how it is not just bound to this infrastructural work, but is very much something that can be approached with humour and artistic vision and experimentation, creativity, and really like exquisite making practices. So I think that, yeah, she is an excellent example of how to marry access and aesthetics. Yeah, and just maybe to end on the note that we had a lot of fun in the exhibition playing with access aesthetics through a series of support structures. We really leaned on Celine Condorelli's idea of support structures, thinking about who gives and gets support. And I mean, we actually renamed these sort of access architecture in the pavilion. And it was really, yeah, fun and playful to consider how we can create access for one body that also creates a barrier for another, but also how to maybe shift that power dynamic and how these are normatively, which bodies are kind of usually prioritized in these kind of infrastructural and
I say it's a
positions.
brilliant exhibition and it's a fantastic space. I mean, I had the privilege of spending quite a bit of time in there on more than one occasion. And it was great to see people interacting and enjoying the work. And if you get a chance to get out and see it, it's well worth it. Yvonne, thanks for winding up the end of our 4 or 5 minutes. It flies past, doesn't it? And you know, some of the things in the chat, like why only 5 minutes? Well, that's the time we've got. But lots of great stuff coming out there. I don't know whether any of you want to, you know, prompted to ask each other questions from that. If not, I'll come launching in with something. But I'm sure there might be, you know, there might be things that that other people have talked about that you go, yeah, okay, that's my experience, and no, it's not my experience. So I don't know. Fire away, Kate. You want to come in?
I'm so curious always about differences in understandings of access between different countries, and in particular different cultural understandings. And I think a lot of us in the kind of Anglo-speaking world have a very similar understanding of what access is or what it can be. And I'm really curious to learn a little bit more, especially from you, Yvonne, about your experience working in Venice. And how the show has been perceived. What does it mean when you put a disabled artist in a national pavilion? I think it's an amazingly wonderful thing and speaks volumes. But I'm super curious to hear if there were frictions or, you know, what were the challenges that came about. And maybe, Sean, you can maybe add as well, because I mean, we've talked before, you and I, about that situation in a Canadian context and working with international artists coming in to Canada. But yeah, I'd love to know a bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. That's a good start. Yvonne, do you want to respond?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Venice is an incredibly inaccessible city for many reasons. And I think this is, you know, actually this to return to the sort of question around like what are these access needs in different places and how do we approach them? I think this was something that very early on, my approach to working with access and accessibility was to think about this sort of diverse spectrum and how they're so often not just physical barriers or architectural barriers, but very much social barriers, right? So social and cultural barriers. And I am not from Finland, I'm Scottish. And so I guess a lot of my practice on thinking, a lot of my practice in the arts was very much kind of coming from a UK you know, a lot of my work working with access and accessibility and thinking about EDI and comes from a kind working within the context of Scottish arts sector. And we didn't have so many frictions necessarily. It's just more these questions of who is this for in a place where it is very hard for the intended audience to actually experience the work, but still needing to take a position on that and say, well, actually, this is, I think we dedicated the pavilion to those who were probably least likely to be able to see it. So I think this is still a really important position to take. And we have had very mixed responses, I have to be honest, of course, but I think we were not, we weren't trying to please everybody.
I was going to say that when I go to Venice, to the Biennale, I've been going for many, many years, I always head for the Australian pavilion because it's got fantastic wheelchair access and an accessible toilet, which is such a rare thing in Venice. And I know Crips, whenever Crips get together, we end up talking about toilets. But, you know, it's always my tip. Anybody who's going to Venice, particularly wheelchair user, go to the Australian Pavilion. Good access. Sean, did you want to come in on there? Because I know Kate, you know, suggested that you might have some insight for us.
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, just kind of building off of what Yvonne said here, I think often about how the way that access kind of is thought about in a lot of institutions is often in that like checklist kind of mentality, and
Yeah.
creates this very flattened understanding of how and who we are as disabled people. And so like, how do you bring in care? How do you bring in respect? How do you bring in those less kind of solid, tangible aspects of access? And so
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of working within here in so-called Canada, especially in Toronto, where we do have an incredibly large, diverse population, lots of folks from immigrant, settler kind of communities. And I guess I'll quickly bring up, I recently made an art piece actually that was about peeling oranges for people, because in my family, like, we didn't really say like I love you. We didn't really ask each other how we're doing. Instead, it's like, here's a plate of fruit, or here's something that you need. And so I think about that as like, how can we create protocols of access that aren't just like centering the most typical forms of access? How do we create access that is anticipatory, thinks about the way that we imagine people coming into a space? How do we imagine disabled people being, vibrant parts of our community? So that's
It's
one
sort of
approach.
looking at it's looking beyond the regulations, isn't it? When I was thinking about this question, it was, okay, for good intention, access is in Britain is rooted around Part M of the building regulations. And, architects, planners, decision makers, funders, it's all about Part M's. They don't look beyond that. So it's kind of a good thing in one sense, and it's a bad thing because it's like the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit. You just, we're not allowed to go more than 30. It's no, you can go under 30 if you want. You can do 25. And it's like the building regulations become a sort of hard line rather than a sort of how do we negotiate this space. And I've just got this book. I'll put it in the chat if I can. It's called Many More Parts Than Part M, and it's by the Disordinary Architecture Project. Zoe Partington, who many of you will know about, sort of authored this book with Joss Boyce. I'm looking at the clock, but I just wanted to, I'm just going back to when we started. Eleanor, you mentioned something that sort of shut up my antenna. And it was this thing that we forget, 24% of disabled people in our, out there, and what society misses out on if our voices are not heard. And how do we, how do we keep reinforcing that? That I know in Venice, people came to the exhibition, we didn't know anything about this. And you say, well, disability art has been around for 40 odd years, been artists doing this work, and just so many people just don't know anything about it. How do we push out that message, I suppose? I ask you because you're doing a great job of doing it at MEMA.
Well, I think it connects to what Kate was talking about with the leadership question. I do think that you can have all the policies in the world. It's like you're saying about Part M, Tony, but if you've not got people in decision-making positions who actually really, really care about a topic and understand a perspective in it, then you get sort of light touch tokenism. And I guess that's where I think the Future Curators program is very exciting. It's a small scale program because, each organization will work with one person. But I mentioned that thing about ripples. I guess if there are now going to be 8 new curators appointed at some point next year through that program, working across the UK in different organizations, they will then do incredible things over the next however long with with all of that experience and status that they gain through that, because some of them will already have a lot of experience but not have the kind of kudos or access to people that is required to, you know, be a thought leader or a sort of institutional leader. But I was going to just say something, Tony, about, I think there's something really interesting happening in the UK between different generations of disabled artists. And I guess what the Shape project in Venice pointed to is exactly what you said, that this discourse has been around for a long time. It's been very important for a long time. But there's maybe a different approach to it and a different set of languages and theoretical references with artists in their 20s and 30s who are thinking about, you know, crypt theory and maybe a more of a conversation around neurodivergence. And I wondered, a question back to you, what is your experience of that, and how do you think we can build bridges across those generations to also make sure that we don't forget and we build solidarity and, you know, informed practice?
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. And I think I've been around a long time. I hate to admit that, but it's true. And I sort of think like what I call second generation disabled artists. We're all like, well, you fought for access and we can get into a studio, we can get into an art college. We don't need to think about this stuff anymore. But actually, after a little while, it occurs to people that you're still going to get discriminated against. You're still going to not get those opportunities. And suddenly they start to come round and go, well, I might not think of myself as a disabled person, but that doesn't really matter, because when I engage with the world, that's how I'm seen. You know, you've got 7 seconds to make an impression. You know, my impression as a wheelchair user is, oh, here's a disabled person, or now here's an old disabled person. You know, so I think it's really important that younger disabled people engage with the disability arts movement or the disability movement, because even though life has got a little easier for us, it's still really difficult. And every time you take 2 wheels forward, you get wheeled back a pace, because the intelligence that we embed into society kind of gets lost and dissipated. And then you've got to train a new lot of curators or gallerists or whoever it is that's in power, and then they leave. And so you're on a constant mission, you know, a mission that I hoped I would be able to escape from 40 years ago or whatever, but still find that, you know, I got to mention the social model of disability, and there's always people who are going to say, oh, what's that? Tell me about that. You know, so I forgot to say there's probably good links on the Shape website or the DAO website. And I just want, and I feel that there are younger disabled artists in the exhibition in Venice, and there's an attempt by the curator to sort of span the decades. So there's artists representing, you know, from way back in history, you know, my first piece, 1991, I think, up until present day. And of course, there are younger disabled artists who were extending on the language that was created years and years ago, and the ideas that were created years ago. So I think it's developing form, and I think that's what makes it so incredibly exciting. You know, it wouldn't be great if we were making the same art that we made 40 years ago. You know, it's great that we're addressing new ideas and new thoughts, and younger people are getting involved in it, of course. You know, it's like music, I guess. You know, it changes and it evolves, but people still like all that wonderful music from years and years ago. I think it's a rich tapestry. You know, I'm really still as interested in it now as I was 40 years ago, and still excited to see the work of young disabled artists and to try and promote those artists and help to navigate some of the barriers that we all face and still face. I don't know if that answered your question. I just went off on a rant. I'm sorry, Ellen. And I've kind of captured the space because my timetable says that I now have to take us to some questions that have come in. If I don't get some audience questions, I'll be in even more trouble. You're in a no-win situation when you chair anything like this. You're always cutting people off in the prime. There's never enough time. But I've got this one question here that's been submitted, and it says, what is the most memorable mistake or cock-up or whatever you want to say? What is the most memorable mistake you experienced with accessibility and inclusion measures at a cultural event? And what did you learn from it? So it might be you're a visitor to it, or it might be that it was your gig. You know, what did you learn? What was the mistake? That silenced everybody. Come on.
I could say that I cannot think of one.
Really?
But that we're always making mistakes, and that's okay.
Yeah.
That like, I think it's also about changing this expectations around like how we're supposed to be perfect, and if we can't, we can't do anything in case we know until we know everything. Actually, I am always making mistakes, and I am happy to make mistakes. I think this like failing in public is a good is a good practice.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, I have a poster stuck up in my room, or a postcard, and it says "Fail again, fail better." You know, so I'm with you on that. Kate, you want to come in?
Yeah, I was thinking about it a little bit from a different perspective. I mean, completely agree with you, Yvonne. It doesn't matter how many times you curate an exhibition or organize a project, there's always something that you forget or overlook or, just didn't think of. But one of the things that I need to get a lot better at is thinking of my own access needs in curating projects and exhibitions. And I think often as people working in positions of leadership in disability arts, we often put the needs of others first, which is, I think, a lovely thing. But at the same time, if you don't look after yourself, then it's very difficult to then sustain yourself as a cultural producer. And I think there's also a lack of discussion around that fundamentally. I think there needs to be a lot more open conversation, not just within the disability community. I think we do that quite well as it is, but also within the mainstream art sector about what are our vulnerabilities, and that, yeah, as you said, Yvonne, it's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to have a body that doesn't always want to function and produce to a capitalist system.
I think one of the things that hold people back is that fear of not getting it right and then being attacked for not getting it right. And what happens is people go, let's just not do it. So we don't take the leap into the unknown and get on with it. So I do think we need to be more courageous and maybe we have to say, yeah, we make mistakes all the time, but what we do is try to learn from them. And maybe that's the thing we take away. I've got a second question to throw at you, and that is, how can art institutions better engage with disabled communities to ensure that their voices and experiences are authentically represented and integrated into the cultural landscape? So who wants to have a crack at that one? Sean.
I'll go with that.
Brilliant.
I think a big part of it is consistency and investment. A lot of spaces want to do the one thing perfectly once, and pour all their budget and time into a single thing. And when disabled folks inevitably, don't come to this event because historically they've not been invited, and they're being burned by these organizations, like, then the institution says, well, there's not really a lot of disabled people in the arts. There's not a lot of disabled people that are artists. And it's like, that's blatantly untrue, but there's not in their sphere. And so I think time and investment, really just a commitment to not just audiences, but artists too, is a really important thing. I'll stop there because we're short on time.
No, but I think that's a really good point. I think it's that catch-22 situation. And we paid for an interpreter, or we put in a temporary accessible toilet and nobody came. So we're never going to do that again. Or we do one token exhibition a year and we don't tell anybody about it because we don't actually want anybody to come and test the flimsy access solutions we put into place. And how do we break through that catch-22, I guess? Yeah. Eleanor, I was hoping you might come up with this because I'm sure within Mima, you'll have some experience to share with us.
Well, I guess I think that organisations, institutions aren't very good at connecting with many communities, and whatever communities means, but let's just use that as a phrase for now. But I just want to bring in Nina Simon here and her writing around the art of relevance. One of my colleagues we just always say to each other, why would anyone care? Like, why do we assume that what we think is important is going to be important to anyone else? If it's not built through dialogue or a listening practice, then it's not relevant, and it's not going to connect with people and resonate. So that writing around the art of relevance, I think, has been very influential for me and helps me think a lot about why on earth would anyone spend their time doing this thing, their precious time, if it doesn't connect with their interests and their ideas. So yeah, I guess it's starting with that question, is like, what's the thing before the invitation? What's the conversation that something is built from?
Yeah. Anybody? I think, Kate, I can't remember if you had your hand up. You may have took it down, but
I did, and I took it down because I didn't want to jump in too quickly, which I always do. Sorry.
no, we're getting near wind-up time, so this is your last opportunity.
Super short. I'll make it super short and very succinct.
We've got 5 minutes between us.
Employ disabled people in arts organizations. Just do it. Get rid of the barriers and employ people with disabilities in arts organizations in positions of power. That's an amazing way to make sure that communities feel addressed, spoken to, and have their voices heard. And before you do that, do your homework and remove the barriers. Most importantly, don't put them in a position where they have to do the double work of reducing their own barriers in order to do the work that they've been hired to do. That's my final point.
Yeah, I mean, Sean, you're nodding your head. Do you want to respond to that?
No, I was just echoing exactly what Kate said.
Yeah.
And like hire disabled people in every aspect, right? Leadership and like leadership of the most impacted too. We want to bring in that intersectional approach, and just institutions should take that risk.
Yvonne, do you want to throw in your last 2 penneth before we kind of?
I mean, I couldn't agree more with everybody else. I don't know if there's anything to add to that.
It is fundamental, isn't it? If you employ disabled people in positions of, I talked about power and rank in my, my intervention. I always say this, it's always about power and rank. If you get disabled people in positions of power, that's when you can change things. It reminds me of, there was a playwright in England who was called Paddy Masefield, and he was on panel for the Arts Council when the lottery money came in for giving to arts organisations, and he became disabled. It was a weird coincidence, but he basically sat on this panel and he said, if you don't allocate grant money to creating access in these massive institutions, then they can't have the money. If they haven't put proper access considerations in, we ain't going to give them any money. And he had to fight. He was the sole member of that panel of people who would kind of just, well, let's think of an excuse why we don't do it. And there's always a great excuse, isn't there? But he did it, and that's not really well known, but it's part of the history of why a lot of the institutions in the UK have got better access. It's because one guy was a difficult git. And I think, we all have to be difficult. I did talk about being subversive, and, I think developer subversiveness is a really good way of helping to steward people into positions of power. I don't want to finish on a negative, but I just want to throw this at you. How many disabled leaders have you come across who said, look, it's really tough because I'm constantly the only voice in the room who's fighting to get this change? And how do we support disabled leaders when we do get them in positions of power? I don't know whether anybody wants to come in and think about that.
I would just say that 2 things to what we're talking about, Tony. One is that it's not only our responsibility. And I think we always have to remember that. And Kate, you said that, but you know, other people make change too and can make change. And the other thing is that I have worked with amazing people who really want to be at this table and invested in this conversation. And I just want to give a shout out to that, because it's really powerful when people who aren't disabled genuinely are engaged in this conversation and make that change themselves, right? They're not waiting for someone else to do it.
Yeah, we have a lot of allies out there, don't we? And I think we sometimes are in danger of forgetting that, you know, find out who our allies are, you know, make sure they're in the link, and that we talk to them and we keep them sort of buoyant and keep them fighting our cause alongside us all. It's been fantastic opportunity to meet with you all. You've been an incredibly generous panel. Thank you for your patience and kindness to me for chairing this, and thank you for your contributions. It's been fantastic. I'm really sorry we were restrained to 5 minutes each, but if anybody's got any final thing that they want to say, that when they click their camera off, they go, damn, do you know what? I wish I'd have just said that. This is your opportunity. What is your last gift to the audience that are here listening to us?
I'll just say something cheesy then, that everyone in the room is already committed to this topic. So everyone here is already part of this change making.
Yep, and there's 282 people according to my participant link at the bottom of my screen here, which is, you know, a good number of people who've took time to check us out. And of course, the other thing we've got to think about is, whilst we are breathing a sigh of relief as our panel 1 comes to an end, you know, we can get a 5-minute break, and then we can reintroduce ourselves to Aidan and panel number 2, who I hope are going to be as exciting and engaging as you guys are. So I'm going to say massive thank you to you all. Unless any of you other want to have you know, Eleanor's had a shot at it. If anybody else wants to have a last shot at it, do tell me before I draw the curtain on our discussion. No takers. I feel like the auctioneer with the hammer up in the hand, waiting for, you know, any more bids before I bring this hammer down. Okay, I'm going to bring the hammer down and say hi to Nora, who's popped up on screen to curtail my nonsense. And I just want to say thanks again to Eleanor, Sean, Kate, and Yvonne. You've been a great panel. Thanks very much indeed. Cheers,
And
guys.
thank you to you too, Tony. Thank you very much for generously facilitating this conversation with us.
Very kind. Thank you. Thanks all. Bye.
Thank you all so much for your so generously sharing your valuable insights, and for that fascinating conversation. Lots to think about. One of my personal takeaways, I think I won't be the only one on this one, that the care clause is something I'm going to carry that one forward for in my own thinking going as I go through my work. So thank you all. We're about to take a short break for about 5 minutes, and we'll be back at 4:25 or 16:25, depending on how you like your time to be read to you. And in the meantime, we'll be sharing a link in the chat for which is our feedback form, which we would like you to complete at the end of your participation today. So we'll see you shortly.
Thanks a lot, Nora. Bye.
Tony.
So welcome back, and thank you to Tony and the panelists for a very interesting conversation there from an institutional viewpoint. And now we move on to the second panel, which is looking at the experience and the opinions of artists and curators from the disability perspective. I'd just like to welcome the panel, which are going to be presenting and part of the conversation. So we have Heather Peak, who is an artist, a visiting professor of fine art at the University of Arts Helsinki, and CEO and artistic director of DASH, a disability visual arts organization working to challenge and create change with exceptional artists. We also have Ana Garcia Jacome. I hope I've got the pronunciation right there. Ana Garcia is a disabled artist from Mexico that loves archives and makes videos. We have Elena Fioris, and I hope I've also got that pronunciation nearly right, is a curator and writer and the author of Access Toolkit for Art Workers. And finally, we have Jenny Julia Wallenheimo-Heimonen, who's an activist whose comedy film about hate speech towards people with disabilities is currently at the Venice Biennale, and who tries to make people jealous that they're not disabled. So welcome, Jenny Julia, and the rest of the panel. So I'd just like to start off with Heather. If you can start off again, we're going to have the similar format, 5 to 6 minutes, and then with each panelist, and then we'll have a shared conversation between ourselves, and then we'll open up for questions to the audience. Heather.
Okay, hi. Okay. Hello everyone. It's really nice to be here. My name's Heather Peake. I'm also known as Heather Morrison as well, and I work as an artist. I'm a middle-aged white woman, and I have short brown curly hair, and I'm wearing a waistcoat, and I'm kind of surrounded by a few of my drawings from my own practice, so triangles and circles. A thematic that you see quite often in neurodivergent work, I think, quite often. So I'm an artist, have been an artist, professional artist for about 25 years. I've worked mostly with my partner, Ivan. You can, if you want to have a little fiddle and look while I'm talking, you can see our work at Morrison_studio on Instagram. And you can also look at Dash at Dash Disability Arts on Instagram as well. So I've been a CEO and an AD of Dash for 1 year and an artist for 25 years. And so I'm in my early stages of doing this new role. Aidan asked me, sort of had a provocation about how my experience of being neurodivergent feeds into my artistic practice, and then consequently feeds into my practice as a CEO and an AD as well. So it's kind of like the neurodivergence is like who I am. Like it's like an entirely kind of emotional, sensational kind of like place where I make work from. And the work that I make with Ivan has always kind of tended to be on a very large scale. And I've made work that really, in the end, holds space. And so I think about this sort of like these edges that I make the work around. And I often think about this work as a kind of like a conduit, really, and a kind of place where you, as an artist, if you're working in the work, so I commission lots of artists to work there, or if you're a viewer, or if you're visiting, or if you're sitting right now in a square that I've designed, or a pavilion that I've designed, or a table, that maybe you feel it. And I'm going to say, like, you feel this, what this sensation is of who I am on earth, and a neurodivergent language, which is absolutely entwined and entangled into everything that we make together. So that's kind of what I'm up to at Dash. So that doesn't make sense, I think. It makes sense in my head. I'm doing the same thing. And so you're supposed to explain it a bit more than that. So then I kind of like start to think about, well, how do I explain that? So my first thought is to say, okay, I'm tilting Dash. That makes sense to me, and I'm assuming it kind of sits with some people. And then so then I'm also in the process of changing Dash. The changing doesn't make enough, doesn't really explain it enough, but it's the kind of like movement from like a sensation of what I'm doing to trying to explain it, to then trying to move it into some kind of neurotypical language that then works so someone else can kind of understand it too. And that's really where Dash is at the moment. There are so many sort of like moments of tilting that are going on at the moment. And I think that one of the things about tilting something is when you tilt it, it tends to tilt back. So we're constantly doing this thing where we're tilting and pushing and tilting and pushing. There are so many things that are in the first panel that we've started to do. We've just done a recruitment process. We only recruit neurodivergent disabled people. We had just had a curator post out, and we had 48 neurodivergent and disabled curators apply for that post. We've just appointed one. So I do know 48 curators, if anybody's interested. And we're just about to go out for another post, which is an executive director post, which will also only be disabled and neurodivergent as well. I have 1 minute left. I'm timing myself, Aidan, which is quite good. So many, Eleanor has just mentioned about the Future Curators program, which is a DASH program they work in partnership with. And Aidan was part of the first round, and it's the most extraordinary program I've inherited from Mike Laywood, who was the artistic director before me for 20 years. We've expanded it and we've just fundraised, and we have enough funding now to go ahead with 6 curators working with 6 institutions and galleries around the UK. But it's kind of interesting, like catalytic program, because when you think about the curator, you then think about the institution and the gallery, then you think about the artists, and then you think about audiences. And then so there's so many elements in relation to that which are there for being untangled as to kind of so many elements in terms of how we do things. One of the things maybe as an artist I'll just speak about is just in terms about aesthetic. Like, what aesthetic do we value? Which aesthetic is the right one in the visual arts? What is that language that we use? And that interests me so much, just in terms of things around thinking about what materials you use, what objects, what mark making, what our palettes, what our form is, you know, and how that intertwines with what we're supposed to be doing, what's right, or what language is the correct language in the visual arts. So that program in particular, it has such an expansion to think critically and in a nuanced way, and actually in a really kind of like beautiful and exciting way about this area too. So 10 seconds. I was just going to say that one of the things I do, and I've always done in my practice, is that I'm looking for people that understand what I'm talking about. So as a neurodivergent leader, it's not safe for me. It doesn't fit. And I don't mean that kind of like, I mean that in a sort of like, I'm looking for islands of places where I can move to, people I can work with, where I know that they can accept me, my team, my artists, just as we are. And when that happens, then you can grow, you can explore, you can be subversive, as Tony says, you can be creative, innovative, and you can hold each other. I'm going to stop. Okay.
Wow, thanks, Heather. I was just making some notes there. That's a really good start. And just a kind of yeah, encompassed everything from also that nice translation from being, you know, your role as an artist and CEO back into the aesthetics, and again, mentioning that kind of growth and experience and holding and care. Thank you. So now I would like to invite Anna Garcia to come in and give us her presentation. And I would just like to say that we have slightly a bit more generous with the time because we have a bit of flexibility because, yeah, so let's go. Over to you, Anna.
Hi, thank you, Aidan. I'm Anna. I'm a visual artist. I'm joining from Mexico. I am a Latinx woman in my early 30s. I have dark shoulder length hair and I am wearing glasses, wearing headphones and a gray hoodie. To make sure I stick to the time, I am going to read my response. My prompt is about the landscape of disabled artists in Mexico and my experience with international collaboration. Okay, so Mexico has a small but strong and growing community of disabled artists, a community of people that identified as disabled, mad, deaf, or chronically ill, whose work challenges traditional representations of disability and of disabled practices, and also centers access as a crucial part of their work, events, and relationships. We are a community that works in different specialties, performing arts, literature, visual arts. We come together because of our shared understanding of disability as an identity that mediates our experience as social beings and as artists. We're not only a group of disabled people making art, but also a group of professional artists that actively work to challenge the paradigm of what is expected when it comes to disability, questioning what bodies are visible and how they are seen, narrated, and interacted with. But when we are apart in our respective fields, we still struggle to make others understand this. In the visual arts, that is my field, I lately find that themes of neurodivergence, mental health, chronic illness, and aging are becoming more frequent, but most artists are not talking about these topics in a disability studies or disability aesthetics framework, nor situating themselves as part of disabled communities. Maybe it is because disability is still met with suspiciousness. In addition, there is also a lack of access to infrastructure, communications, and working practices, and these barriers are not only for artists trying to show their work, but also for other disabled cultural workers, as well as for disabled audiences. In this landscape, the way to navigate the art world is through community and collaboration, becoming allies with projects and artists whose themes and identities center intersectionality and engage in cross-movement solidarity. However, having the resources to work and properly engage is almost never a given. I want to share an experience that sums up my thoughts about disability aesthetics. In 2023, my friend and collaborator Emily Binney and I got an Unlimited and British Council International Partner Award to work on our project Moving the Image Representing, Reframing, Reclaiming. It is a project about archival representations of disabled, mad, and chronically ill women in Mexico and the UK. It was a year-long project that involved many collaborators in UK and Mexico, and it turned into one of my favorite projects so far. First, it was because of the relationships we built and the conversations we had. I had a great collaborator to initiate the process with, based on many shared interests and a lot of conversation. And we had a great team to facilitate access, to enrich the conversation, and contribute a diversity of experiences, hopes, and dreams to the project. The creative aspect of the project was thriving. But this was possible because on the more practical side, we had the economic safety that the award provided. For me, it was the first time that I had funding that felt like enough to cover everything from materials to fair fees for everyone involved, and also for our own access needs. This project is so meaningful to me because it embodies what I believe that disability aesthetics are. Not only images, sounds, or words, but also a practice. It involves conversation and collaboration, but also distributing resources in a way that centers access and cares for the participants. The themes and ideas discussed aren't just appealing abstractions, but we are actively trying to ground them, to practice them. It may sound easy, but it is not. It involves a lot of self-awareness and constant communication, and funding and an accessible process to get it. But as everything else, it gets easier with practice. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, another really rich presentation there, Anagathia. And yeah, I mean, the themes of intersectionality, solidarity, community, collaboration, and again, resources or lack of resources is coming through. And yeah, I was just struck by the idea that that's kind of coming across is not only do we have to make the work as disabled artists and curators, but then we also have to do the change as well. And that's an extra labor. So perhaps I'll come back to that in the questions and answer section. Thank you. So now if we can go to Erla, then for her presentation, for your presentation, that would be great. Thank you.
Hey, Aidan, and yeah, thank you everyone for your wonderful presentations. It's been very interesting. I am a white woman with long curly brown hair on the top of my head. I have silver frame glasses on, and I'm wearing a Palestinian flag badge on my chest. So I was asked how I work in many institutions across Europe at the intersection of disability and queer aesthetics, and how has this been, and how have you done this whilst navigating the needs of the institutions you've worked with? So I felt like a very loaded question, and I hope I can bring some experience and some insight into that, into those questions. I'd firstly want to state that obviously I'm Irish, my accent is Irish. So I have the passport privilege of perhaps pre-Brexit. So I can work across the UK, Ireland, and other EU countries in a way that may be difficult for others. And the situation for me is varying. I've worked in the Netherlands, Germany, the UK, and Ireland mostly. I would say the situation in the UK is good and improving. The same in the Netherlands. Germany, difficult, as discussed previously. But most of my experience is in Ireland. And there has been a great commitment by organizations and funders in Ireland to commit to access or commit to accessible ways of working, and to match that with funding. And I'm going to speak through my particular experience of curating Tulka, which is a festival in my hometown in Galway in the west of Ireland, which I curated the 21st edition opening in November last year. It responded to the carceral legacy of Ireland. So Ireland had the highest number of psychiatric beds in the world in the 1950s, under particularly prison-like conditions, and that particularly affected disabled people. So I find that many of the organizations I come to work with is the expectation of sharing knowledge, and bringing access knowledge with me. And there seems to be a feminized perspective on that you are expected to bring knowledge about access and disability with you, as the curator, often uncompensated. And that it is to be done kind of in a non-combative sense, and it feels like a tricky negotiation. There feels like there's expectation set there. And that's the reason I wrote Access Toolkit for Art Workers, was to kind of unburden myself from those expectations of institutions that often hired me for reasons of my access knowledge, but also perhaps for other curatorial reasons or for my networks. And I wanted to kind of unburden myself from those expectations, and provide that access toolkit so I can just get on with my work. And working in Tulka was particularly interesting because it's my hometown, so I know it deeply. I know the politics, I know the stakeholders, I know the barriers. For those who aren't familiar, it's an old medieval city, so it's lots of steps, it's narrow sidewalks, it's narrow doors, it's protected buildings. And I approached this in a way that was sensitive to the topic, which is the incarceration of disabled people, the particular legacy of and sensitivities around those kind of lived histories of people who are still alive today who were affected by those histories, about the access condition of the city I worked within, and the conditions we had for the festival. So the festival is a medium-sized festival. There was about there's a 2-person core team and then about 5 other people doing that work. And we partnered with Arts and Disability Ireland as access consultants. And combined with my local knowledge, we were able to tailor access to that location. So originally we wanted to do Irish Sign Language interpretation, but we were advised that actually most Irish Sign Language users live in Dublin, the capital, and that we would reduce more access barriers by using captioning. So all our events were captioned. We published a book reflecting on the experience of incarceration, of disability justice, of abolitionism. And of course, that publication was accessible. So the font was large, the font was accessible, there was a high contrast. But we also thought about trigger warnings and thought about how hurtful or how triggering some of these materials may be to the audience that we're reaching out towards, for people who may have been in these institutions or whose families may have been in these institutions. And in the terms of working with artists, we produced a number of artists, particularly Bridget O'Gorman, for a new commission. And through that, we experimented with new ways of being, of new ways of working, of anti-ableist ways of working. That included hiring support workers for artists who needed them, for flexible outcomes and deadlines. So there was no quality or aesthetic outcomes or deadlines expected of artists. They could produce whatever they could within the conditions that they were provided with. and we were as flexible with deadlines as possible. Each artist got an access questionnaire, and each artist had kind of a custom access experience, I suppose you could call it. And that was a learning curve. And I also wanted to give space. I'm really bad with timing, but I want to give space to failure and fatigue and the experience as a disabled curator, even if I was surrounded by like 20 amazing disabled artists and like a really supportive organization in my hometown, I felt like I was constantly failing. I was so exhausted. I was so nervous that, oh, maybe I missed this person's access needs, or what are we going to do about this artwork that is behind steps and there's nothing we can do about it because it's a protected building, or how do I hold everyone? And as a disabled curator who often moves around different locations and you're not held by an institution, it can feel like you're on the edge of fatigue, of failure, of not living up to the expectations that you bring with you as someone who perhaps has been a leader in your sector or in your community or in your locality.
Sorry, is that a possible good place to end?
Yeah, thank you for cutting me off.
Sorry, it's like you can finish.
I appreciate to be cut off. This is the only thing I would say is that as a curator who needs to travel around to make money, unfortunately, I don't fly, so I travel by boat and ferry. And I think we need to think about how travel is made accessible for individuals who do need to travel to make money, especially if you're disabled and hauling suitcases on trains. Thank you.
Wow, again, an awful lot in there. And I'm just thinking, like the theme that's coming through is just I mean, you were talking about bringing the knowledge with you and the expectations. And again, it's this thing about, as disabled artists, curators, how much extra labor there is involved and how much is expected of us to bring our own kind of capacity with us, and then also to change the institution or help the institution as well. And I think this is, and yeah, and then also those interesting issues around aesthetics as well, and which is a really nice segue to Jenny Julia, whose work at the Venice Biennale is a really good example of the disability aesthetic. Jenny Julia.
Thank you, Aidan. I'm Jenny Julia. I'm short, middle-aged, red hair, wearing a pink shirt in front of a banderole saying "Ramp is a red carpet." And I will quickly provoke you with 3 topics related to Venice. Most important first, for me, disability aesthetics means events, spaces, projects, and works that doesn't spoil anyone's performance or identity. And in the Pavilion of Finland, as Yvonne told, together with artists Pia Lindman, Pidha Saimia, curators Jussi Koitala, Yvonne Billimore, and architect Kaisa Sööpt, we tried to create a hospitable, but figuratively saying a weightless space for diverse audiences. And this meant a lot of accessibility aesthetics. We had to add one more marble plate in front of the pavilion to get rid of a threshold. There is a tactile map in the pavilion. We have audio descriptions, which you can, by the way, listen online in English all over the world if you don't have access to Venice. We have an artistic handrail from which you can take mental or physical support. It's sometimes going up to the ceiling. We have benches to rest, and then Pia Lindman's works can also be touched or smelled. And in my own work, I think there are at least 4 types of disability aesthetics. First, the topic, as you said, Aidan, it's about hate speech against people with disabilities in social and healthcare. So it's a political theme highlighting the attitudes of the gatekeepers. Then my textile installation should look best from the sitting height or short adult perspective, because I'm always working on the floor, so I didn't want to give advantage to people with so-called normal height, and actually children have loved it because of that. Because my film is about hate speech, but we are exhibiting in a multilingual context, I decided to make a silent comedy about this topic. And I also included a lot of activists from Finland, so that if the film is going to be spread over later, these activists can also participate this political topic in panel discussions. Fourth thing is that because the presence of disability is always easier to see than our absence, I wanted to have the classical disability symbol. So in the ceiling of the pavilion, there is a wheelchair making somersaults. It's a kinetic sculpture. My second provocation, the truth is that I would have never applied to the Biennale if it would have been an open call, not an invitation. When our selection was announced, there were immediate criticism that an open call would have been more democratic way. And it's perfectly okay to criticize selections. I think it's important. But as an activist, I disagree about the fairness of open calls. If you afford to belong to artist associations, you may hear about the call in a newsletter. But if your mother tongue is Sami or sign language, or you don't speak Finnish, Swedish, or English here, the call may not even reach you. Then you have to be in the position where you can work related to time and money for free for weeks, maybe months, have other kind of support. And in a very small country, it's very unlikely to have anyone familiar with disability arts or accessible applications in the selection board. But I think most of all, you should have this guts, this belief that it would be possible to go to the Venice to show, for example, disability arts. So my participation is due to the invitation of our curators, and I'm thrilled and I'm excited and super happy, but I'm using my last minute with a little bit pessimistic talks related to what Kate talked earlier. I'm afraid also that in these fragmenting societies, disability arts right now doesn't arouse this curiosity that it would need to break through to the mainstream. In my case, this participating Venice didn't change the perspective. Our main newspaper found it important to describe on the cultural pages how I walk with my crutch at the opening reception and what is my diagnosis. And I'm afraid that this thing that we are imagine what's going on in other marginals, what is happening in other bubbles is really dangerous in our time. In evolution, being left outside the herd means death. So I'm ending with the question that where would this better future come from if we are not really dreaming about it together?
Wow, thanks, Jenny, earlier. The thing about the evolution and being outside the herd meaning death, that's a really strong comment. But also about this collective dreaming and about change. So thank you. One of the things that's coming up and is around, well, one about the extra labor that we have to do, and also about access and how that is part of the aesthetic. So one of the questions that I would like to ask, and also your comments, Jenny, earlier reminded me of what Eleanor was saying at the beginning about not what do we, what do we miss out by not having us included as disabled artists and curators and a disabled voice. So how does access impact on the aesthetics of a work when we're trying to make work accessible, and an artist might make work in a particular form and to look a particular way and to have a particular feel, and then we might have to put we add accessible interpretation, for example, captions or sign language interpretation. How does that impact on the work that you want to create, and how do you think that the access impacts on what the audience sees in the work? Does anybody want to take that question? Ella.
Yeah, hi. So I think it's a complicated question because it has many and varying outcomes. I think speaking to Jo Verrett from Unlimited as part of the work around my access toolkit, she talks about intrinsic access compared to maybe perhaps a more American style of access, and thinking about access as a conversation between the organization, the artist, and the audience. So, you know, what is your audience? What access needs do they have? What access needs does the artist have? What commitments does the organization have? And what are the aesthetic sensibilities or values that that triangle contains? And there, perhaps a suite of access tools could emerge, like perhaps only a certain, audio description or sign language or physical access is necessary, but maybe there's a different constellation, and it's about kind of figuring those things out and not coming to an artwork, especially as a curator and a producer. I don't want to prescribe a set of access tools for an artist, and it's more about navigating that space in an open dialogue.
Thank you. I was also just thinking about the how the audience experiences it as well, because obviously they're part of that artistic conversation between artist, institution, and audience. Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond to that question about access impacting what we experience as audience on artists?
I think I'd say something, Aidan, because I've thought about this quite a lot in the last, in the older time that I've been making work, in the last 25 years, and the kind of conversations that we may have had between Asada and I when we're making work, all the way through, and how that has been how that's changed, and how it's been a process, and how we've learned from each piece, actually, and how particularly those conversations, so building it in from the very beginning. So how do you how does it becomes part of practice? It's like a fundamental, so it's like the sensation of what it is you're going to make comes from that place, rather than thinking about what you want to make and then even like thinking about it and then adjusting even beforehand, like actually sensing it from a position of would you like. And I think it's about something about it's like stepping right back to the feeling of that the audience will belong there, like they belong, they don't have to fit into it, like they have a moment when they are there where you, and I know this sensation, it as a neurodivergent person, which is where I'm coming from in terms of this, is that you're shot, you just relax, you're just like, okay, this is a pace for me, this is something, I feel it. And that's all of the practical physical access, as well as the psychological safety that actually can be built into a piece of art. And you and so I suppose our work had kind of like, that's something we would talk about, and I was certainly something that I hope that I'm moved dash towards, is that there's a sensation and a feeling actually that's inbuilt. It, you feel safe, you feel okay, and I think one of the things that happens then is when that happens, then access actually starts to become a different kind of conversation, because if you feel safe, then you're also able to, then different access needs become much more easier to talk about, because you start to understand each other.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to respond to that?
Well, I could continue. I love this thought of inbuilt accessibility, but unfortunately, it's really rare to have a commissioned work where where it's going to be shown, and of course you can think about subtitles or audio descriptions when you're making a video. But I would like to give an example, because I'm thinking we are still lacking this kind of rebellious experimental style, and I was in a situation where I got a gallery space which was extremely beautiful, perfect lighting, but in the center of the room, 50% of the floor was half-story deep, reachable only by 9 steps. And of course, there would have been an option to, opt out. This is oppressive, this is discriminating. But I spent weeks thinking like, how I'm going to do it, and I finally realized that it's just a hole, and what we do with holes, we just fill them. So then when I got this thought that I can rent scaffolding and build a podium, and there won't be any hole, and everybody will be equally watching the works on the podium behind the handrail of the main floor level. Of course, the whole works changed. It wasn't the same exhibition that I had built in my mind, because there wasn't individual platforms, but there was just one giant cake almost with these frost white fabrics. But I'm still I'm telling this example because there's so often situations where organizations or galleries say that no can do. I mean, this space is not suitable for you. But if we if we are also as artists fighting that, you know, you're not, we are going to do it somehow. So there is these ways. Of course, I'm not asking anyone to crawl in or not use the washrooms or anything like this, but there are a lot of things when we can visualize the inaccessibility, and maybe the audience becomes allies when they realize that, hey, why this is done this way, why this artwork has these strange accessibility solutions included.
Yeah, I think so. Just what you just said there, Jenny, Julia, about something that is very, very physical, and then just comparing it to Heather's comments about this idea of the psychological, of neurodivergence, of feeling things, and about that, yeah, and about safety. And I think that kind of introduces the like when a lot of people think about access or disability that don't have the experience, it's very much about the visible and the physical. And so it's like when architects are thinking, or people are saying, but we have a ramp, or we have a lift. And it's like thinking about other forms of access that I think are also important. I'd just like to go to one of the questions from Margot, who says, in a country like France, where we're very late on disability rights and justice, what do you think should be the first actions to take when you're starting from no visible disabled artists and or disabled artists network? So where do you start, I guess, with the change? A massive question, but just if you would like to take a bite out of that. Anybody tempted?
Well, this is Anna speaking. I think that, yeah, that is such a complicated question, but I think I would start by finding my disabled community, you know, because at least for me in Mexico, that's also a place that's kind of not on the upfront in disability rights and disability arts and stuff. I think that was a really big step for me, for myself, for um, my personal process with disability, but also with my career as a disabled artist, to find my disabled community, you know, because, you know, disabilities are so different from each other. So being aware of all these different needs, different access, and different processes, all this stuff is really very helpful to open up your own ideas about disability, your own creative processes, and like to be aware of what we need socially to in society in general, but also in the art world, to address, to make visible, to start like building a plan. So I think first having those conversations with the community is always the best place to start.
Oh, yeah, I'd like to come back to you on that one, Anna. I'm just thinking, because you spoke a lot about community and as that being like a place to start, and how important that was, and the collaboration, intersectionality, solidarity. So I'm just thinking of like the invisibility of disabled artists and disabled curators, and then how do you go about finding them? How do you go about creating that sense of community, which is so important, rather than just being like an individual lost within the art system?
Well, that's also hard and it takes a long time, I think. But you need to do a lot of research. You need to start attending to every disability related event that you can find near you. And sometimes you will find stuff that is not really aligned with your perspective or with what you're looking for, because there's still a lot of, especially in the arts, a lot of um, perspectives that are very focused on like art therapy or stuff that is it's all right, but it's not exactly the perspective that I'm looking as a professional artist that wants to be inside like the artwork and make a living out of it. So you really need to be sure of what you want and what your work is trying to achieve, what are the best ways to do it, or you need to really be kind of with one foot on the art world that you want to be in and the other in the disability community. So it's really a lot of work and it's really hard to change your mindset from one to the other, because as people in this panel already said, there's like a lot of adjusting language from like neurotypical or disabled language to non-disabled language. That's a whole issue. There's a lot of that needs a lot of energy to make that kind of thing work. But I think, yeah, it takes a long time, but it's the only way to do it, at least in my experience.
Thank you. Would it, Erle?
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And I was thinking the same around community building, but going off what Jenna Yulia was saying about experimentation, I also think it's important to experiment with agitation and kind of agitate. So in Ireland, because the disability rights movement came out of activism and agitation, particularly around this history of incarceration, there is a legacy in the art world in Ireland, specifically organizations called Chronic Collective and Disability Artists and Disability Academics, who are really agitating for change on a social level, but also on an artistic level. So Chronic Collective have experimented with what like COVID safe and accessible programming and event making in public space in Ireland looks like. And they've really led by an example by taking lots of risk, and they've built a disabled community around them because it kind of gave people a language and also gave people a safe space to congregate and gather. And then DADA, the disability artists and disability activists, have agitated around discrimination disabled people face, specifically around funding and disability welfare payments. And of course, in Ireland, we had the a universal basic income for artists, and that complicated things for disabled artists on welfare. So I think as part of that kind of community building or gathering or kind of finding those people, it's kind of about agitating, which is I hope it's.
Thank you. Does anybody else like to respond? I would just like to go back to that question about where do you start? Like in a country that has no history of disability arts or art by disabled people, where do you start? And I guess one of the words that you mentioned, Anna, was about being professional disabled artist. And this idea that, I guess, introducing the idea of professional, and that if you're, one of the things that I had encountered is that if you don't have an art degree, which I don't, then how can you possibly be an artist? Because many countries have systems like the academy and validation, rather than, and if you haven't been to art school and you don't have a studio, then how do you become like an artist? So yeah, so to go back to Margot's question, where would you, what's the first thing? Or have you found a difference in being like identifying as an artist or curator and then identifying as a disabled neurodivergent person about how you've been perceived?
Well, it's quiet here. Maybe people think that yes, we are the happiest country in the world, but unfortunately in Finland we don't have too many professionally educated artists in the disability field in the community. And one reason is that they studied artists who were applying to university level art studies, and most artists who get to the university have years of training and guidance behind them. And unfortunately, children art schools in Finland are not accessible, or people don't get access there. They don't have assistants to go there, or they don't get drives there. Their parents may not think art as the best option for a disabled child. Yeah, also in civic schools, they are many in old school buildings. I don't know. It's really hard for as an artist to talk about like starting from kindergarten art education. I was really impressed this year to see that Kone Foundation was publicly protecting our climate change activists and telling why it's so important that they in the upper level support these activists. And I started thinking that what if we don't start from the bottom, but what if foundations start talking to the universities that why we're not getting any applications from artists with disabilities, and then universities may think about their practices and maybe ask from civic schools and kindergarten level. So what if we try to go backwards? Would it be more effective that there is always just one artist trying to take one step up? But this is just imagination.
Yeah, I think that's that begins to speak of the hierarchy. I've got a question from Andrew Gannon who says, is it useful to talk about the frustration of making work and exhibitions from a disability aesthetic point of view, and then for them to be received in a typically institutional or socially ableist way? So you make work within the disability aesthetic and then it's placed in a very ableist normative environment.
And Aidan, and one of the things that we're talking about, I can see that she's here, so I've been talking to Amanda Lynch about this. It's just about, disabled and neurodivergent writers and art writing basically as well. So how like how actually we don't tend to have those people there. There aren't many of them that are then able to see it to approach in a different way actually. I think as well, I mean, our whole the visual arts is sort of like a kind of like ecosystem that ends up at some point in the commercial art world. And it has a huge effect on everything that's going on all the time, and that's money and capitalism here. So it just has this effect where you might like this, I'm always doing this, I see everything so visually. There might be a piece of work that then is written about, whether it lands in the way, does it land in how it lands? Yeah, that's the thing I'm always concerned about, how it then gets interpreted and how it's then seen. We haven't got that in continuity of people to do that, and I think that's something that that needs to happen. There needs to be more of those people talking about the work. There needs to be, in a way, like you're constantly, I feel like my whole of my practice has been this thing where I've been basically bridging all the time and then suffering the effects of bridging, like because it's tiring. And having to constantly interpret all the time, and it's that like the disconnect, and I one of the things that I do hope is that something instead of us having to make the bridges, I think something that Eleanor talked about, I do see now there are more people making bridges this way. Not many, but there are some happening now. And that's something that's shifting around from which I see.
I think some of it is also that potentially, like when we maybe go and see some work of like Frida Kahlo, that the disability element of Frida Kahlo's life is erased. And then how do we normalize that conversation around disability and access and other people's lives? And then, and that, oh, I could do that, or that aspirational, representational, who are your kind of, who are the people who you look up to as a growing child with a disability or acquiring a disability. There's a comment here from Ben Evans in the chat. And it's also it's interesting to notice within the art, so that the disability aesthetic is very prevalent and very present within the dance and performance world. And Ben Evans is saying, in the performing arts in Europe, there's been a huge benefit for closer networking between institutions and artists, advocacy, shared experience, comparing national lobbying successes. Might there be an institution on this call that would be willing to facilitate such a European network in visual arts, gathering people together to talk and share online? And I would suggest not just online, but in person. And because we've all seen the benefits of disabled bodies and disabled people on stage in the performance and dance. There's a question from Trish here. Trish,
Aidan, can I just, is it all right if I just say something to that? Because that's totally, we've just been doing a piece of work, which is kind of, so one of the things that, so we've been trying to do a piece of work recently with international curator, Rachel, and Fleming Mulford, exactly around that, like trying to find, we've done a mapping exercise basically of international mapping exercise to find equivalent dashes or to find groups to, I talked about this idea of where are those islands that we can jump to, so we've done a bit of that work together, but it's been very, very hard and very difficult actually to gather all of that information together. But yes, absolutely, like that piece of work absolutely needs to happen, and we have started it. And I would totally be up for gathering together people to look at what that looks like, for sure. And I think it's much more of a sculptural network, because it's not lots of galleries and institutions. Actually, it's people. And sometimes it's a few people together, and sometimes it's like a big institution that has someone extraordinary working at it. And it's about making that connection all the way around, of that sensation, of that feeling of like, okay, we can work together. Yeah, and you're doing the work. Who's doing the work? Sorry.
That's good. In fact, there's a comment from Alison Driver saying, at Ben Evans, this sounds like an opportunity for the British Council to support. Indeed, we are keen to hear from local EU professionals and organisations on whether this is something of interest to pursue. So there's an open invitation from the British Council to start something from interested organisations around disability and visual arts. So that's great. Just to, as a final or beginning to wrap up, the question from Trish. One of the things I love about work by disabled artists from a UK perspective is often the combination of humour and something that opens up new narratives about what it is to be human. What do you love about the work of disabled artists? And could you give an example of an artist that you particularly of the work within a particularly like a disability aesthetic?
I'll go. I hope I'm not taking too much space up. Thanks for a lovely question, and I think I will speak towards the question around how work is received and this question in the same way. So one of my favorite things about working with disabled artists is exploring new ways of working and new ways of presenting work that that sense of humor, that sense of solidarity, and the how things can go wrong and how we live with it and how we move on. And one of my favorite works artists is Bridget O'Gorman. She's a very dear artist to me, and she produced a new body of work for Tulka, using these casts and resins to make these kind of tubular type of work. She worked with glass and mosaic, and they were so incredibly fragile, and they were kind of representative of the fragility of the body, but also the fragility of support work and collaboration. The work was called Support Work, and it was the first work she made with a support worker. But they kept on breaking, and she just kept on laughing because she's like, yeah, my body keeps on breaking, and these works are as fragile. And I think she was successfully reframed, like this disability aesthetic we're discussing. And I think it's the value of disability arts is quite undervalued, and I think disability arts is often it can be a negative stamp, unfortunately. And it's thinking about how as a community we frame that and we communicate that. And I think that the role of getting disabled writers and disabled curators and really kind of reframing what disability aesthetics and disability art means and highlighting all the amazing work we do.
Thank you. Anybody else with a reason why they enjoy working within a disability context and the work of a disabled artist?
Well, I like a lot of things about disability aesthetics and the topics that it brings to the attention. I also enjoy the humor a lot. And I can talk a little bit about the work of Mexican artist Nur Mata, that is Nurmatta. And she has this piece that's called There's the Ramp, in like an ironic way of saying that. And it's like an inflatable ramp that is blocking the way to the entrance of an exhibition spot. So I think it is a very humorous yet critical way of addressing all this lack of access and how it is perceived by institutions and places and just everyone that's not disabled about what is access. And yeah, I think another artist whose work I really enjoy is Emily Barker. She's from the US, and they also talk a lot about access, but kind of shifting the scale of like furniture and stuff like that, to make it evident to people who are not disabled what it's like to navigate the world as a disabled person.
Thank you. Heather or Yenny?
Yeah, but it's like, who do you choose? Like, who's gonna, so like, because I suppose maybe I'll just get right in my niche, really, because I really, really like seeing work made by neurodivergent artists. I particularly like I love the work of other autists. It's a very particular language, which I find kind of like the most relaxing, and is often, I love the incoherence of it sometimes to other people and how it speaks directly to me. I find, so I mean, when I think about those artists, I think of someone like Sonia Bouet and Becky Beasley and Ashok Mystery. I think Ashok's here actually as well. And they all create works that I get this feeling that I'm okay and they're okay. And
I'm just aware that it's almost time to wrap up and to bring Nora back in. I'd like to thank you all for an interesting conversation. And I think it just shows there's a lot about like the extra labor that we have, the importance of community, of understanding, of language. That it was interesting that you used the word translation initially there, Heather. And that about resources and care. and this kind of coming together and practice and doing. And that almost like giving permission, giving ourselves and other people permission to fail and to get it wrong and get it better next time. So thank you very much. And I'd also like to thank the first panelists as well. So over to you, Nora.
Hello again. Many thanks again to our panelists for another insightful and valuable discussion, which I sense has sparked a number of new connections and seeded some new activities and actions going forward. I hope you have found this after the ideas that were shared stimulating, and invite you to share your feedback on the event in the poll, which is in the chat. It will only take 4 minutes maximum for you to input to. It's really valuable for us because it helps us develop and grow and improve our work as we go forward with you. So in addition to this, we will also be sharing a new guide called The Visual Arts and Disability in the UK, a snapshot in 2024. This is a digital resource which explores where the UK is at this moment and how we got there in terms of the representation of disabled artists and curators, and how disability is perceived as a curatorial theme, where best practice is happening and what the key challenges are. So please watch out for that popping up in your email inbox, and it will also be available to download from our website. Again, hopefully the link will be in the chat for you to access this afternoon or evening or whatever hour it is in your wonderful part of the world. I would like now to draw the event to a close by thanking once again all of you for joining and giving up your time today to take part in this and to listen, for our wonderful partners Disability Arts Online, for the raft of talented interpreters who have helped this afternoon, sorry, whatever time of day it is with you, and our inspiring panelists, and of course the wonderful curator Aidan Moesby for expertly taking us through this journey today. So thank you and goodbye. Take care, everyone.